This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. This is episode 257. I'm your host, Jess Root, from cardswire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site covering the Arizona Cardinals, and my co-host, as is almost always the case, is Seth Cox from revengeofthebirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site. Both of us are analysts, both of us are fans. We grew up watching the Cardinals, paying attention, so now we get to write about them, and we cover them from a perspective where we do cover them as fans, but also as media analysts. So we get the unique perspective that sometimes isn't the case. And this is our post-Super Bowl show, as there's a hodgepodge of things going on in the Cardinals world, but number one is that we have a new world champion, and that would be the Kansas City Chiefs, who overcame a 10-point fourth quarter deficit in the Super Bowl against the San Francisco 49ers to win the game 31-20. Patrick Mahomes, MVP. Andy Reid gets his first ring. Several former Arizona Cardinals also get a championship. Seth, among the things that we want to talk about in this show is the Super Bowl. Now, let's talk about that first, and we'll talk about what the rest is coming up. But the Super Bowl, what did you think of it on the whole?
I thought the game was entertaining. I thought there was definitely some lulls within the game. Not uncommon, though. I mean, there's always going to be lulls in the game. And then I thought it was quite interesting, the collapse of the San Francisco 49ers. Another collapse for a Kyle Shanahan-led offense. And then obviously Shanahan was not the head coach, but, you know, part of that infamous 26-3 come from ahead loss to the New England Patriots. So, you know, I mean, we can't really talk because we're Arizona Cardinals fans and, you know, we're dealing with our own issues, but you do have to wonder if two games, 33-point leads, you know, combined in those two games and zero championships is a concern. But of course, at least, you know, Shanny's getting his teams there. So I guess once we get to that glass house, we can start throwing stones too. Right. But at least they're there. So I guess that's the place you start.
Right. We're going to talk about, we'll talk more about the Super Bowl in just a second, kind of going over what we're going to cover in this show. We're going to talk about the Super Bowl, our reactions, our reflections, and kind of connect the Cardinals to it as we move forward. Kyler Murray was Offensive Rookie of the Year. Chandler Jones was not Defensive Player of the Year. We'll look at that. We'll kind of discuss those ideas. Larry Fitzgerald gets a new award. Edgerrin James is a Hall of Famer. They picked up a Canadian Football League quarterback. We know one more of the coaches, a familiar face, and kind of the last part of the show, we'll go back to the Senior Bowl as we're now heavy into draft season and get to talk a little bit about the Senior Bowl and what happened there, prospects that stood out as we start talking a little bit about the draft. Getting back to the Super Bowl, first and foremost, let's just sit in awe of Patrick Mahomes, who his rookie year basically sat, but what he's done in the 2 years since then is nothing short of just almost non-human, like otherworldly, because, you know, first year starting in the league, he tears the league apart, throws for over 5,000 yards, throws 50 touchdowns. He's the league MVP. They get to the playoffs. They come so close to making it to the Super Bowl. They lose to the Patriots in overtime in the AFC Championship game. Then they come back in his second year as a starter. He doesn't have quite the numbers, but it's almost more impressive what they did as he rallies the team so often, and now he's a Super Bowl MVP. There was a stat, I'm sure you saw it, and it was shared on social media from Trey Wingo of ESPN. Mahomes was 5-0 this season. 5-0. When his team fell behind by 10 points or more. Now, it happened in every playoff game. They were down 24-0 in the game against the Texans. They came back to win 51-31. They just blew the doors off against Houston. They were behind 17-7 to the Titans. Came back to win that game. And in the Super Bowl, they were down 20-10 in the fourth quarter, and they scored 3 touchdowns in the final 7.5 minutes. Really something quite impressive. But just the fact that he didn't lose a game. So they lost a few games this year, but it wasn't they didn't every single time they fell behind by more than 10 points or more. So it's double score, 2-score game. Those are hard to come back. You don't see a lot of success. He didn't lose. As in, one, it was only 5 games in which the Chiefs fell behind by 10 points or more all season, and they won all of them. The amazing stat is the fact that Kurt Warner, this is not meant to disparage Warner's career, but just to contrast someone who had an absolutely fantastic career. This is Kurt Warner, Hall of Fame quarterback, took 2 teams to 3 Super Bowls. He's a league MVP. And his record in games where his team fell 10 points behind or more is 2-44. 46 times in his career, his team fell behind by 10 points or more. They lost 44 of those. And those are, and he had 53 career losses. So 44 of his 53 career losses, that's in the regular season and the postseason, were when his team fell behind. I don't know what other quarterbacks look like, but if you kind of look at Kyler Murray, this year alone, when the Cardinals fell behind 10 points or more, he was 0-9-1. That one was the season opener, the season opening tie. You don't come back from that. Patrick Mahomes is already the best quarterback in the NFL, and he's doing things that no one has ever done.
And he's going to continue to do them. He plays the game at a different pace than so many others. He's got the arm strength that few players ever have had, but he plays at a cerebral level that few can as well. You see his ability to create and make plays, and I thought actually he played his worst when he was trying to play at a conservative pace to start the game, when he seemed a little probably nervous. I mean, for the first time in his NFL career, where there's a lot of expectations on him and what he's going to put out there. And so I was more impressed to see him overcome and adapt and really kind of excel at the end of the game and in the fourth quarter. Because remember, he went into the fourth quarter, he had a rushing touchdown, but he had 2 interceptions, and he came back from that, and he was able to kind of put them on his back and will his team late to a game. And that throw, that 44-yard pass to Tyreek Hill is one of those where it's everything that you've ever taught quarterbacks not to do, but he's one of the guys that's special enough to be able to do something like that.
Well, and going back, I was watching on one of those talk shows on ESPN today. We're recording, by the way, on a Monday night. Seth is traveling, so we're recording actually a night earlier than we normally do, so you get the reactions a little bit more quickly. The Sammy Watkins play where he totally torched Richard Sherman, I got an interesting perspective on that, in the fact that what he did was that got him burned was use his brain. He was playing the odds, and he saw Watkins make an inside move, so he moved inside to kind of take away that leverage, to take away that play, because, in the rules of route running, running a fade wouldn't make sense after that because it would be a very difficult throw, and it just showed, well, one, Watkins had the speed to be able to get open, and two, that Mahomes was a special enough quarterback to be able to make that throw, and it made Sherman look ridiculous, but, in almost any other setting, in any other scenario, any other receiver, quarterback, that throw isn't going to get made. And so you see just the talent and the playmaking that there is, because Sammy Watkins, he kind of became not even like of everyone that you talked about with the threats and the weapons they have, Sammy Watkins kind of became, he didn't have a good year. If you look at what he was expected to do, he had 673 yards and three touchdowns.
And almost all of that came in the first game of the season.
Right. And you look at that in the fact that someone with that talent is kind of an afterthought, but look at the, just the talent around between Damian Williams and Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce and Sammy Watkins. You can almost forget about it and forget just how talented he is. When we talk about Jimmy Garoppolo, did we learn anything about him? Did he become exposed, or what can we take away from his play?
He's a guy that, he's better than Trent Dilfer was in those things, but he's in that kind of mold where you're not wanting him to have to win the game for you. And when throws had to be made late, the Chiefs did a really good job of taking away his security blankets and forcing him to make plays more vertically than he has against any other team not named the Arizona Cardinals all year. So, the reality was that the concern was if Jimmy had to make plays, and it looked like at the time that he wasn't going to have to. I don't know how you felt, but it felt like they had that 10-point lead with 8 minutes to go. You felt comfortable that they could do something, that they could make, get one or two plays in order to ice the game away, but they couldn't. And when that's the disparity in quarterbacks there. And not to take anything away from the Chiefs' talent overall, but I think you find when you have a quarterback advantage that severe, that if you give them too much room to work with to come back, it's going to be a problem. And it really was. And it came back and bit the 49ers. And then when they had to go to Jimmy and say, hey, we need you to make these plays, it's not that he's not capable. It's just, that's not his strength. I think you and I would both agree with that. Like, that's not where you want Jimmy Garoppolo, the quarterback. And to tie this into the Arizona Cardinals and what you kind of talked about earlier, that may not be Kyler Murray, because that's a very rare thing. You talked about Kurt Warner. That's a Hall of Fame quarterback. You go look at Peyton Manning even, one of the 5 greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. And he's not a guy that you necessarily wanted down by 2+ scores because, all of a sudden he's forcing the ball and he's, having turnovers. Guys like Mahomes and Tom Brady, those guys are unique, and they end up being the ones that get talked about in different breath than everybody else, where even greats like Manning, like Drew Brees, you still are kind of, you can be made into human. And I'm sure there will be times when Patrick Mahomes is made human, but thus far he has been otherworldly. And the only guy that stopped him is the greatest quarterback that's ever stepped on a football field. Think about that.
Right, and it was only because they didn't because the way the rules were in overtime, Mahomes didn't get a chance to get the ball because the Kansas City defense didn't stop him.
And so, it sounds really simple, but the reality is at this time, and it's only 2 years. It really is. But at this time, you're talking about a trajectory that only one player has ever, been on, and that's Tom Brady. Not even the great Peyton Manning, not even the NFL leader in touchdowns thrown in NFL history, Drew Brees. Like, none of those guys are on the same trajectory that Mahomes is on. And again, I think you and I both agree, knock on wood, let's hope nothing ever happens to him from an injury standpoint, that we can enjoy a 15-year run of his greatness and just revel at that. Because here's the other thing, and it gets overlooked a lot too, is that Brady did it when guys that are mentioned as top 10 quarterbacks of all time are doing it as well. Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, obviously Manning. Like, those guys were all in the league at the same exact time as Tom Brady, Ben Roethlisberger. These are all guys that are first ballot Hall of Fame quarterbacks or first ballot Hall of Fame players, and Brady's the guy. And so I'm not crowning Mahomes yet, but his trajectory is of the same, which means that there's going to be 5 or 6 guys that play with him. I would say Deshaun Watson's probably one of those guys right now. Lamar Jackson looks to be one of those guys right now. That play with him in the same time frame, but they're all going to fall short of the overall career of Mahomes. And again, that's a lot of hyperbole, and I understand that, and it can flip. But again, from his first 2 seasons as a starter, the path that he is headed down is something that we've been fortunate enough to see, but it's only been with one other player.
Now, here's the thing. I want to tie this into the Cardinals. Is this? Here's my question: what if Alex Smith had not been the quarterback for the Chiefs that rookie year? What would Mahomes have looked like as a rookie? Because I think, wouldn't it be reasonable to think that what Kyler Murray did this year would be kind of similar to what Mahomes, I would have to imagine Mahomes probably would have had somewhat of a Kyler type season as a rookie. And why I point that out is now we enter year 2 for Kyler. Mahomes is, in some ways, is one of the comps, a minor comp that Murray as a quarterback, with the connection with Cliff Kingsbury, the baseball. He's the size of Russell Wilson, but he does some of the same things that Mahomes does. Can we, even dreaming, think that maybe that Murray can take year 2 and do something similar to what Mahomes did in either year 2 or year 3 of Mahomes' career?
Again, I think it's maybe unfair because of how good Mahomes has been, but I don't think it's unfair to hope that he can be on a similar trajectory. I just don't know if you're going to get the same results, if that makes sense.
Right. My thoughts are, thinking back, if Mahomes had started every game as a rookie, I bet his numbers would have. I don't think he would have been 2018 Mahomes, I think he'd have been kind of like the 2019 Murray, which would have led to, obviously, we know what he did last year, but we've seen the skill set that Murray's got, and if they give him some, obviously Mahomes has some incredible playmakers around him, even more so in 2018 than 2019, as you had the running game too with the Kareem Hunt, which was kind of what made things go. You put Murray in that situation. Say you got Kenyon Drake back. They get a big-time receiver. You get some development from Andy Isabella, Christian Kirk. But I'm not saying 5,000 yards, 50 touchdowns, but the same sort of impact. Maybe not like the video game numbers, but kind of. Well, you see some of the same things in him, and you see how Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. And what I want to do as a Cardinals fan is to say, if Patrick Mahomes can do that, I'm excited because I think Kyler Murray has the potential to be able to do some of the same things.
Yeah, and I think he does. I think who he is as a competitor is one of the similarities that you see with Mahomes. They're both guys that have this drive that you just feel like this is a guy that can carry a team and carry a franchise and kind of move them forward. But again, I hate that at the same time because you're talking about an iconic player at this point in Mahomes, where Mahomes is kind of on his own as a player right now in a trajectory. Now, I think that Murray can put up similar numbers to what Mahomes did this year, where he had some injuries and he continued. He was not, like you said, that MVP Mahomes, but he was still great. I mean, don't get us wrong. He was fantastic. And it's ironic because you look at the Chiefs as a team this year and you look at their numbers from their two quarterbacks in their 16 starts, and you've got what most people would say is a great season. I mean, for just under 4,700 yards, 30 passing touchdowns to only 5 interceptions on the season. That's insane. And so if you can get from Kyler in year 2 the same type of numbers that Mahomes had this year, where you're talking just over 4,000 yards, 26 touchdowns to only 5 interceptions, I think everybody would say, okay, like he's well on his way now. Because you add in his likely 500 plus yards rushing and probably another 4 to 6 touchdowns, and now you're at 35 touchdowns and over 4,500 yards of total offense. And again, if he can just be under, I think 10 interceptions, I think as growth goes, that is ideal.
The Chiefs obviously had several connections to the Cardinals. 5 of them, 5 former Cardinals on their roster in all. Tyrann Mathieu is the most notable. You also had Terrell Suggs, Xavier Williams, that is, Anthony Sherman, and on injured reserve Alex Okafor. It was another reason why I was cheering for the Chiefs, because of the Cardinals' connections, and obviously, conversely, is the fact that there was not a single Cardinals connection player-wise on the San Francisco roster, which made it kind of easy. I know many fans are very bitter with how things ended here in Arizona with Tyrann Mathieu, but what a player to be able to come back from what he's done, to become a leader on that defense, and to get a championship. He didn't do anything special in the Super Bowl himself, but I'm happy for him. I'm happy for Xavier Williams, who undrafted guy, made an impact in Arizona, has stuck around in Kansas City, even though he didn't get a play. He played 0 snaps against the 49ers. Anthony Sherman, drafted by the Cardinals way back when. But then Terrell Suggs, I mean, you sort of, there's a bittersweet to that. Obviously, Suggs is an icon here because of his time at Arizona State and at Hamilton High School. But the way things went down in Arizona was very disappointing. But at the same time, he does get another ring, and twice he's been able to do it against the 49ers, so at least he's helped the Cardinals in that sense.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you start with Matthew, like you said. He's kind of the big draw at this point. And, you and I have talked quite a bit in our history together doing this show, how we're always going to side with players. I don't think we don't have any problem with a team asking for money back or asking a player to take a pay cut, but we also always understand why players say no or why there may be hard feelings afterwards. And I know that Matthew's kind of hard on his sleeve and willingness to say things about your favorite team that many of us don't want to hear rubs people the wrong way. But it's the same reason that so many people gravitated towards him in the beginning. So, you take it when it's good. I think you have to take it when it's bad, and in this case, about your team. Matthew is a guy that was very he believed in himself in a very strong way. And the thing I know that hurts him the most was that the Cardinals asking him for money back, while it is about the money, it was more about the respect, because he felt like them asking for him to return money meant that they didn't believe he could get back to being the Honey Badger, to being the guy that they willingly paid all that money to. So he just said flat out, no, I will prove you wrong. And he did. And so, again, I 100% understand when people are irritated by him. I truly do understand it. However, I think you have to be willing to see his perspective on it and why he took it so hard. Like you said, Terrell Suggs is a different animal. That's a different beast. He was a guy that he took the money and then he became a shell of his former self in what we had seen from him as an all-pro type, as a guy that, again, like you said, that you saw at ASU, that you saw be probably the greatest high school player in Arizona State history, or in the history of the state of Arizona. And so to see that then kind of regression, not because of age, but maybe because there was just less of a drive, that's a harder pill to swallow. Yeah, I think it's super cool that Xavier Williams is still in the NFL. He's kind of that, like you said, that journeyman guy that just he gets to places and he's able to make it, and it's not something you see very often for the NFL. So for a guy to be, I think he's in his sixth season now, fifth or sixth season in the NFL, and be a contributor, That's awesome. Anthony Sherman's one of those ones where you look back and it didn't make sense that they were so willing to just give him away, but it also is what it is when your coach is saying, like, hey, I'm not going to use you, so I don't really need you.
Right. But I mean, who doesn't remember Javier Arenas? Come on.
The sad part is I will always remember Javier Arenas simply because they traded an all-pro fullback for a guy that was basically a throw it at the wall, see if it sticks type.
Coming next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We're going to talk about the awards. Kyler Murray, Rookie of the Year. Chandler Jones, not Defensive Player of the Year. That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Kyler Murray was the Offensive Rookie of the Year, despite not even being the favorite. And let's be honest, the fans, the Oakland and Tennessee fans, kind of salty after the award was announced. Even A.J. Brown of the Tennessee Titans, the rookie receiver, had a fantastic year. He was in the running. Got caught with a tweet right after the announcement was made, and he tweeted BS with the actual word, only deleted it, and he apologized for tweeting it, but not what he said, or maybe it was just bad timing. But how surprised were you when the announcement was made and it actually was Kyler who won it and not Josh Jacobs?
It's interesting because it was the opposite last year. However, and I like Josh Jacobs. I think he had a really nice season. So, and obviously we're Cardinals fans, but when you kind of look at what Josh Jacobs did and you look at it, there wasn't this like blown away type of feeling that you expect when people were basically saying, no, it has to be Josh Jacobs. Look what he did. And you go back and you look at his numbers, and I know it's not just all about the numbers, but when you look at his numbers, he barely beat out, or he had less, I think, total yards from scrimmage than Miles Sanders did in Philly, rushing and receiving combined. So it's not absurd to see that Kyler won when you look at the overall change that he brought to the Arizona Cardinals and the continued growth that you saw from him as a player this year. This was a really impressive season, and it was historical in the way that Kyler produced and played. And so it's really easy to get caught up in the Josh Jacobs hype, and 100% deserves it. He's a fantastic player. But I don't think his season was enough, at least in my mind, to overcome how good Kyler was this year.
What was more shocking to me, now, I wasn't completely surprised. I was thrilled. And it made sense. How many rookie running backs have we seen come into the league and rush for 1,100 yards?
Right.
That's pretty common.
Right.
What Kyler did had only been matched by one other person in terms of production. Only Cam Newton, the only other rookie to throw for more than 3,500 yards and to rush for more than 500 yards. And on top of that he was so careful. I mean, towards the end of the season, he turned the ball over more, but he set a rookie record for consecutive passing attempts without an interception. He and the general feel from players around the league is, wow, he's good and he's scary. And it's going to be scary how good he's going to be. I wasn't surprised that he won. I was glad he was one. But what surprised me was how the voting turned out. That he got more than 50. It wasn't even close. He got 26 and a half votes to Josh Jacobs' 13, where you can clearly see that the writers, the AP writers, the 50 Associated Press reporters, the writers who had the votes, valued what Murray, not only what he accomplished, but the context of his accomplishments, where he came in as the number one pick, the unquestioned starter from the very beginning on a team that was so bad the previous year, to turn them into a competitive team, to exceed basically every expectation, well, at least meet every expectation that was heaped upon him as a savior of the franchise, and to do it and to have a season that is nearly unprecedented. It really was gratifying to see that it happened, especially if you take the context of here in the Phoenix area, where it seems that without question, every great accomplishment by a player seems to get overlooked, whether it's Devin Booker on the Suns, Chandler Jones or the Cardinals, this or that. You just see over and over again the Cardinals or the local fans here, they're great players, don't get the credit that they should be due. And Kyler did, and in an overwhelming decision.
Well, and again, not to take anything away from Josh Jacobs, but 1,150 yards on the season is not something, like you said, that's unpredictable from a rookie. I mean, there's been 36 other rookie running backs in NFL history to go over 1,150 yards, and you know, they weren't all the rookies of the year either. I mean, you look back just in this generation, you've had Doug Martin. Everybody remember what was it? Pocket Hamster, or what was that? Was that his nickname? He had 1,400, so he had 300 more yards. Now, Jacobs missed 3 games, but 300 more yards is quite a bit. I mean, when you look at, Kareem Hunt was drafted in the 3rd round. He had over 1,300 yards. Jordan Howard was drafted in the 5th round. He had over 1,300 yards. Alfred Morris, everybody remembers that season where he had 1,600 yards. I mean, the list kind of goes on. And so, when Ezekiel Elliott has 1,600 yards or Saquon has over 1,300 yards from just rushing, those are the seasons that jump out at you. And again, that's not taking anything away from Josh Jacobs. He was fantastic this year, 1,150 yards, 7 rushing touchdowns. What he finished with receiving 166 receiving yards. So, he's not a big receiving threat out of the backfield, but to get just over 1,300 total yards from scrimmage as a rookie and 7 total touchdowns, I think that's fantastic. I mean, he averaged nearly 5 yards per carry. So he was a great player this year. But I just don't understand the context of why people would be upset, other than you're just a fan of that team. And I would have felt the same way if Kyler didn't win. I mean, I think when you put Kyler's performance in the scope of time, his stands out as more in terms of special, but it's not as though he was the only player ever to do 3,500 and 500, like you said. Cam Newton's done it before, and to be fair, Cam Newton had a better overall season his first year than Kyler did. So you just have to look at it from that perspective. I like A.J. Brown. I think he's going to be a really good player in this league for a really, really long time. And so I mean this as nicely as possible. 1,051 yard, season with 52 catches. I think the most impressive things is that he averaged only over 20 yards per reception. But I mean, 65.7 yards per game. That's good, but it's not like, again, you're not talking about history making type stuff to overcome again what Kyler did. I think those were the two main guys that really had a claim to it, and like I said, with AJ, 1,051 yards and 8 touchdowns. AJ Green had similar numbers as a rookie, and he didn't win Rookie of the Year. I mean, and so you're comparing basically AJ Brown and AJ Green's rookie seasons to Cam and Kyler's rookie seasons. So, and that was the same year in 2011. So that there is precedent that they're going to take the historical work of a quarterback over a very good rookie season for a wide receiver, but not in a historical context.
The other guy that obviously that was disappointing is that Chandler Jones did not get Defensive Player of the Year. That went to Stephon Gilmore of the New England Patriots. I was disappointed, but I wasn't surprised. I think it really hurt Jones that he didn't get that last sack. I think, honestly, one sack would have done it. He got to 20, he's Defensive Player of the Year, but he doesn't get that final sack, and he doesn't even win the sack title. And instead, you've got a guy in Stephon Gilmore who's been fantastic all year, leads the league in interceptions, he returns 2 for touchdowns, and also makes the most plays on passes in the league, leading the league in 20 pass breakups. So I get it. I get why, but it seems almost foolish that one sack really is the difference, because Chandler Jones was so fantastic in doing it in a different context. But if you're not even the best sack artist in the league, again, it's hard to say that you're the Defensive Player of the Year, even though it lined up that way. He had 2 4-sack games. He was Defensive Player of the Week twice. He was Defensive Player of the Month. He came a sack away from 20, but he isn't Defensive Player of the Year. And I really think if he gets one more sack, he gets 1 sack in that season finale, I think it locks it up for him, because 20 sacks is historic.
Well, and I think the thing that hurt Chandler the most was that most of his numbers were sack-based. So you look at it, he had the 19 sacks, which was good for second in the NFL, plus 3.5 in third place. But the other numbers are what hurt him. So tackles for loss, he cracked the top 25. He only had 11. Barrett had 19. So he had a half a sack more, and he had 8 additional tackles for loss on this season. Quarterback hits, Chandler is way down the list, like not even super. Oh, never mind. He was at 7th, but that was still 11 behind Shaq Barrett. So again, if you everything else being equal, you throw out everything else. Barrett beat him in sacks, tackles for loss, and quarterback hits. And the tackles for loss and quarterback hits were much more in the favor of Shaq than Chandler. Chandler beat him in forced fumbles by 2, 8-6. So that, again, how do you say, and I thought it was in that Shaq didn't get an all-pro nod, but Chandler did. So I think when you look at it from that perspective, there was a guy that outperformed him in every major statistical category for their position, and yet they still, in the All-Pro voting, gave it to Chandler over Shaq Barrett. So I think you kind of take that and you say thank you and move forward, if that makes sense.
Coming next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. We're talking a little bit more about some more awards. This time we're going to talk about Larry Fitzgerald, Edgerrin James. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. Back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. And my goodness, I think we have come to the point where I don't think there's anything left for Larry Fitzgerald to accomplish except for that title, which he probably isn't going to get. He's one of the greatest football players ever to grace the field in the NFL. He's one of the most respected, probably the most respected player in the entire league. He's number 2 in receptions all time. He's been one of the greatest receivers of all time. He's in the top 5. Has historic postseason numbers. He's been a Walter Payton Man of the Year, and now he wins the first Microsoft Surface Anything But Ordinary award, where it basically recognizes off the field passions, not the community work, but basically the hobbies. Fitzgerald is one of the best on the field. He's one of the best in terms of what he wins at doing good in the community. He wins at hobbies. He wins in the bank account. Is there anything this guy can't do?
No, and I thought it was really cool that the NFL created an award to kind of just add on to the legacy of Larry Fitzgerald when they also named him to the NFL 100 all 100 team for, the 100 greatest players in NFL history. So, I mean, I don't know what the award is or what it actually means. I just know that he won it, and it's cool that Larry Fitzgerald continues to be somebody and something to enjoy and be excited about for the Arizona Cardinals, which, in their history is not very common.
And the truth is, there's only one thing that he has yet to prove in terms of greatness, and that's to win. And he's been to the Super Bowl. He was great in the Super Bowl. He almost won the Super Bowl. But that's really the one achievement he hasn't got. That's literally the only thing left.
Well, and I think most people would agree that he's like, if you're building an all-time playoff roster, he's one of your wide receivers because of how incredible his playoff performances in his career have been. I mean, he's one of the greatest playoff receivers in the history of the NFL. So
now, I was thrilled to see Edgerrin James get into the Hall of Fame. He, probably no one will remember, other than Cardinals fans, no one will remember Edgerrin James on the Cardinals. This isn't even like the Emmitt Smith move, which was completely was just a PR stunt to get fans in the seats because there's so many Cowboys fans here in Arizona. But when Edgerrin James' time with the Indianapolis Colts came to a close, he was arguably the best running back in football. Between kind of the dual threat, you had Marshall Faulk, and then you had Edgerrin James. And that was basically it in terms of who did everything. The 3 down, do it in the running game, do it in the passing game, and do it as a blocker too. Edgerrin James did it all. He was so dynamic. Missed out on the Colts title. He made that offense special. But when he came to the Cardinals, he was not a dynamic back anymore. He was a volume runner, but even still, he had two of the top 7 rushing seasons in Cardinals history. And he wasn't even good anymore. I think the longest run he had as a Cardinal in those 3 years he was with the team was 17 yards. He He didn't get tackled for losses many times. He always moved the pile, but even still, as bad as people believed he was, look at the numbers. He had over 1,100 yards one year. He had over 1,200 yards another year, and 2 of the 7 single season highest totals in franchise history. And they're still at top 8, 2 of the top 8, because David Johnson's 2016 cracked that group. And you look at that, and those seasons I think were every bit as necessary for his Hall of Fame status, because they got him those milestones in his career. Got him over 15,000 rush. What was the total that he came up with? But it got him over those milestones. And on top of that, he was critical to the Cardinals Super Bowl run. He ended up having to split time with Tim Hightower during the season, but in the playoffs, the running game was all about Edgerrin James, and in the success that they had running the ball in the playoffs got them to the Super Bowl. Edge deserved to be a Hall of Famer, and I'm thrilled for him, but his career really wasn't complete until he was a Cardinal.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where you just look at it from a bulk number standpoint, and he almost finished his Cardinals career 45 games with 3,000 rushing yards, which is incredible when you think about the fact that, as Jess said, the Cardinals don't really ever have good running backs. I think he's top 15 still all time for Arizona Cardinals in rushing yards. I think he was 13th, but I could be wrong. But I think he's 13th all time in terms of career rushing yards, which is staggering and also sad, because that was only 45 games. I mean, 45 career games, and this guy is in your top 15 for one of the oldest franchises in the NFL.
Number 13. He's number 13 in franchise history.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, it's insane to say that his yards per carry, was, like Jess said, was not great. I think he was sub 4 every year he was here, but he is a true running back, a guy that knows how to run. He didn't have the wiggle he had when he came out. And you look at his first 2 years in Indy, and he had over 3,200 yards rushing in 2 seasons. The guy was just a freak of nature. He was an explosive and special running back in a time where you had guys, coming along like LaDainian Tomlinson and Curtis Martin and Priest Holmes and all of these guys, and Edge gets overlooked because those guys were on. He was always playing in Peyton Manning's shadows. I mean, you talk about the Chargers, and they were LT's team because Drew Brees wasn't quite Drew Brees yet, and Phillip Rivers was young, and then Curtis Martin played with a bunch of guys at quarterback. I mean, can you even name the Jets quarterbacks that were handing the ball off to Curtis Martin? And Priest Holmes was in the Trent Green era of Kansas City. I mean, so these guys that came along were great, and those were the guys that were getting the All-Pros stuff. And Edge was just kind of the security blanket to Peyton Manning. He was the guy that he didn't make the offense go, but he was the one that kept the offense going, so to speak. And he and Manning together in those first 7 years in Indy was just a special thing to watch. And Edge is definitely one of those guys, like, he's a Hall of Famer, but he's also part of the Hall of what could have been, because he blew out his knee in Miami. He battled injury issues in Indy for 2 seasons after his first 3 years where he was just a monster. And then he just became kind of a grinded out guy that just knew how to run, knew how to eat up clock and yards, and that's what he did. I think you hit it on the head when you can tack on nearly 3,000 rushing yards and 16 rushing touchdowns in a 3-year span for one of the, most moribund franchises in the NFL and help them reach a level that they'd never seen before. That all goes into the consideration of that. And again, the numbers weren't gaudy, but the numbers were solid, and he did his job, and he was a guy that you could count on every Sunday. And that's, that was big for not only the Colts, but the Cardinals in their run with Ken Whisenhunt.
It was. You look at his career, he finishes number 13 all time in NFL. And you look at that all-time list, it's really impressive because you've got, of the top 16 all-time rushers, 14 are Hall of Famers, and the other 2 are still playing, Frank Gore and Adrian Peterson. And Edgerrin James is number 13. He's just, I think he's 35 yards behind Marshall Faulk, who was a consensus Hall of Famer because of what he did. But you take his time only at Indy. Before he goes to the Cardinals, he had 9,200 rushing yards. That would have put him just ahead of Amon Green, number 37 or number 38 all time. He's not a Hall of Famer then. Even as great as he was, he probably wouldn't have scratched the Hall of Fame at that point. He needed those seasons with the Cardinals.
And it's interesting because you've just brought up a name, and it's ironic because I think their careers are a bit similar in terms of all of that. Like Frank Gore, I mean, he's a guy with a bunch of freaking yards, just a ton, and he's going to end up in the Hall of Fame. And I don't know if you could ever point to a season where you're like, oh yeah, Frank Gore is definitely the best running back in the NFL. But you can point to a number of seasons where you're like, Frank Gore is a difference maker at running back. And that's kind of how Edge was. I mean, Edge, think about this with Edgerrin James. He made 1 All-Pro team and 2 Pro Bowls in his career. His All-Pro team was his rookie season. He put up a better statistical year in his second year when he made his second Pro Bowl, but he was never an All-Pro again. And you look at Frank Gore, and that's going to be a similar thing. You're going to have a guy that he's going to have all the numbers and all of that, but he's never going to have kind of the ancillary things. He's never going to have the All-Pro nods. He's never going to be, this multi-time Pro Bowler because Gore has had to deal with an onslaught of running backs that were better than him and then ended their careers while he just continues to churn out yardage.
It really is fantastic. Coming next on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We're going to keep on moving. Now moving on to a little bit of Cardinals talk. A Canadian Football League quarterback is on the roster soon. That's coming next on Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. It hasn't been official, and it can't happen, but there was a report about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. The Cardinals brought in a couple of Canadian Football League players, one being Chris Streveler, and quarterback for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, the champions of the CFL this last season. And on Monday, the report comes out that he will be signing with the Cardinals, that the Blue Bombers are going to cut him, and he's going to move on to the NFL. The Cardinals can't technically sign him until February 11th, when is the first that you can sign CFL players who are no longer under a contract. But what's interesting is the type of player he is, one. Two, the fact that he's coming from the CFL, which basically there's been no real quarterback of any sort of note go from the CFL to the NFL since like 2006. From according to the article, a guy that I actually never even heard of. But not only did they bring him in, but reportedly they are going to guarantee $100,000 plus of his futures contract, which is going to be a minimum contract, but he's going to make about $500,000. But they're guaranteeing $100,000-ish of that contract for a guy that never was drafted or really found a spot in the NFL after his career in college. what do you think of this? Because I have my thoughts on this initially, but what is your reaction to this news? Well, first when you heard the tryout, and then when you heard about the impending signing.
I always wonder what these guaranteed contracts are that Steve Keim likes to hand out. It's something we've talked about before with, Bryce Butler, Andre Smith. Like, I don't understand just waiting to see what he has. But, according to everybody in the media that knows that it was going to be, or there were going to be a number of teams interested. So if the Cardinals feel like he brings something, and I'm not going to lie, I have no idea what that is, then being the team that's willing to offer him some guarantees in that contract makes sense. But again, I don't know what it is.
Well, when I first saw the workout, you never want to rest on your laurels with the quarterbacks that you have at the back end of your roster. So when I first saw Chris Streveler, okay, he's potentially a guy that's gonna compete with Drew Anderson for that maybe roster spot, probably practice squad spot. Okay. But then they're throwing $100,000 of guaranteed money at him that says they're going to give him a really long look this offseason. And you're like, wait, what? Maybe he's going to be their backup? When you already have, you could bring back Brett Hundley and feel completely comfortable with him. Or what's odd, let's be honest. The most logical thing, and more probably the completely predictable thing that the Cardinals will do this offseason is bring Case Keenum, a guy that Cliff Kingsbury absolutely adores. He's probably going to be his quarterback's coach here soon, once Case decides he's done with the NFL. But instead, you're going to throw $100,000 of guaranteed money at a Canadian Football League quarterback. Now, in a little bit of context, practice squad, undrafted players. NFL teams have a total of about $100,000. I think it changes, fluctuates every year. I think last year was about $96,000. $96,000 in guaranteed money is the total amount that they can use in signing bonus money or guaranteed money to sign all of their undrafted rookies. So that means there's an undrafted player, every once in a while there's a player that a team will throw all of that at. That's a player that they really like coming out of college, or other guys, sometimes it's hit and miss. I think Alani Fua played special teams pretty well for the Cardinals for a couple of years out of BYU. I believe he got $45,000 or so of their guaranteed money one year. Cornerback Sojourn Shelton out of Wisconsin got $25,000, didn't end actually sticking, but he's back with the team. So they are throwing more money at a Canadian Football League quarterback than they can to do all of their guaranteed money for their undrafted rookies this year. Interesting. People are talking about him because he's a guy. Streveler was known as Streveler the Leveler. He was good his first year in the CFL. But you look at his numbers, they're not great. He threw 19 touchdown passes in 2 years and was picked off 19 times. He threw for, I think it was over 2,800 yards. And then he rushed for another about 1,200 yards. He's a dual threat guy and scored another 25 touchdowns. So he's definitely a running type quarterback. I hear people making the comparison. Oh, he could be the Cardinals' Taysom Hill. Okay, there's a problem in my mind. Taysom Hill worked out really, really well in New Orleans, in part because Drew Brees is one type of passer. He's a passing quarterback. He's a traditional pocket quarterback. Why in heaven's name do you need a dual threat gadget player when your starting quarterback is Kyler Murray, who can do the gadget plays? Now, unless you think you can also add Streveler in to play like Taysom Hill does, play on special teams. He's a gunner. He can block punts. He can play tight end and run the ball and things like that. I see no value in that, especially since you have to burn a roster spot for a third quarterback unless you really think he can be the backup. And if they think if he's going to be their backup quarterback, I've got questions about what this franchise is doing in terms of that. Unless they're trying to go chintzy on that so they have more money elsewhere, because Brett Hundley's going to cost more than 1.2 or 1.3 million. Case Keenum's going to cost more than that. But you can't go with your franchise quarterback. You can't go with the backup quarterback being a CFL flameout, right? You don't think? I don't. It doesn't make any sense to me.
No, it really doesn't, and it's one of those situations where, I guess we just have to sit and watch it unfold and then kind of go from there, because it just doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make sense to guarantee money at this time when, while their number in terms of cap space is large, their number of open roster spots is really large too. So it just feels like a bit of an overreaction, but at the same time, I don't want to go crazy. I'll let it play out, see how it works.
It'll be interesting to see how that goes. If it even happens. I mean, the report still, the Cardinals can't even do anything until February 11th, technically. Coming up, so Rise of Secret podcast, Grove Sour Talk, Cardinals Talk on the web. Got another coaching report, and it's a familiar face. So Cardinals have a new defensive line coach, but it's an old defensive line coach. That's coming up next on Rise of Sea Red. We're back on the Rise of Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals Talk on the web. It looks like Brentson Buckner's coming back. Former defensive line coach under Bruce Arians. He went to Tampa before Bruce Arians was there. Then when Bruce Arians was there, he left Tampa, ended up in Oakland, then was let go after this last season. Brentson Buckner, reportedly, not announced yet, is back on the coaching staff for the Cardinals, which, I'll be honest, this is an interesting thing to me because, as far as I know, there is no connection to Vance Joseph or Cliff Kingsbury, which makes this kind of another Steve Keim coaching edition. I'm glad he's back, but I was surprised, to be honest. What did you think when you saw that news?
Yeah, I was surprised by it. I didn't expect to see him back. I don't think it's a bad thing. He's a talented coach, and he tends to get the most out of his guys. But it was interesting to see him get back with the team after, like you said, there's no history between Cliff and Brentson, or Vance and Brentson. So yeah, it feels like it's probably a Steve Keim move, and that this is Keim trying to fix, some of the issues and bring in somebody he trusts, because we know he does trust them.
And that's true. Brentson, I mean, I have no problem with the move. It's just, I'm really shocked. And I think more than ever, I continue to be impressed with Cliff Kingsbury's willingness to trust other guys and to bring in and to work with coaches who he's not worked with before. And that's a very uncommon thing to do. Obviously, he brought in his guys. So he brought David Rye is his guy. But some of the other guys that brought, Vance Joseph was brought in. They let Vance get his guys. But now they've replaced their defensive line coach. They bring in Jim Dre, who has no connection to Kingsbury or Vance Joseph, but has a connection with the organization because he was drafted by him. And then they brought in Darius Swinton. He's Jeff Rogers' guy because he's followed him everywhere. And it's really interesting how I continue to be impressed by how Kingsbury, who doesn't have a bunch of NFL guys yet, how he's willing to lean on other guys for staff. Obviously, Kingsbury had to be comfortable with him or they wouldn't have hired him. But you have to know that Buckner's addition came highly recommended by Steve Keim and not necessarily Vance Joseph. And also very surprised that the guy that they hired isn't a guy who had previous connections with Vance Joseph, since that was basically all the defensive staff has had connections to him.
Yeah, and so, you wonder if that was part of the agreement to keep Vance Joseph. So I think that's where we'll kind of walk through. And again, I don't think it's a bad thing, because clearly they need to have some growth along the defensive line, but it is always, like you said, odd to see it when it's not a guy with a history of the defensive coordinator.
So basically what that leaves us with on the staff, if they're just going to replace tit for tat the guys that they know of. So we know that they let an assistant receivers coach go. They left their D-line and assistant D-line coach, an assistant special teams coach, and an assistant strength and conditioning coach guy. Those 5 guys have been moved on. They have the assistant special teams coach. You have a defensive line coach. You bring in Jim Dre, who now does quality control, and Spencer Whipple is reportedly going to move over and probably be the assistant receivers coach to David Rye. He will get to work side by side now with Andy Isabella, who, by the way, Spencer Whipple was Isabella's position coach at Massachusetts and also was the passing game coordinator there. So there's some movement there that'll make sense. So what we don't have is an assistant. You don't have the assistant defensive line coach, and you don't have the assistant strength and conditioning guys. And so we still haven't heard anything. It was about this time last year when they announced the coaching changes. We'll see if that happens sooner or later. But coming up next on the SEC Rep Podcast, Best Hour of Cardinals Talk on the Web, we're going to wrap this up talking about the Senior Bowl. Seth's going to give us more or less most of the lowdown about the Senior Bowl, since he is more of the draft guy. I lean on him for his thoughts, and I'll give a few thoughts of what I saw from what happened at the Senior Bowl. So that's coming next on Rise of Sea Red. We're back on the Rise of Sea Red Podcast, the Best Hour of Cardinals Talk on the Web. In our time off, the Senior Bowl happened. Obviously, that's the first of the big draft things happening. It doesn't include all the big names, obviously, because of the 100-plus underclassmen in this year's draft. They don't end up in the Senior Bowl, except for those that got their graduation, got their degree in 3 years. So a guy like Eno Benjamin for ASU was in the Senior Bowl, even though he left after only 3 seasons. Let's talk about who are the players that kind of helped themselves, whether it be for the practice or the game. From my observations, really the only thing that stood out to me was, hey, there's some running back talent that might fit the Arizona Cardinals, and you don't necessarily have to use a premium pick on you. You see the performance of a guy like Darius Anderson out of TCU, the plays that he made in the running game and the passing game, you could see him filling in for or building into what Kenyon Drake did, or maybe even the Antonio Gibson kid out of Memphis. Joshua Kelly out of UCLA also was fantastic in that game. But if there was one takeaway, it's that, hey, if the Cardinals don't, because we kind of talked about this in our offseason needs, that they either needed to bring back Kenyon Drake or they're going to keep David Johnson. But maybe, just maybe, if they decided to trade Johnson and they don't bring back Kenyon Drake, we said they're going to have to use a premium pick to bring in one of the big names. Maybe they don't. Maybe they don't need to do that, and they could find someone maybe a little more name than say Chase Edmonds was when he came out of college, and be just fine.
Yeah, and that's the thing is you kind of nailed it with the running back situation there. Um, I think the two big winners were the kid out of UCLA, the Kelly kid, and and then I thought so Joshua Kelly, and then I thought the Darius Anderson kid out of TCU. He was really good. He had 130 all-purpose yards in the game. But two guys that, you mentioned one in Antonio Gibson, who kind of reminds me of David Johnson, coming out. So Antonio Gibson played at Memphis with former ASU OC and now current Florida State head coach. And Gibson is a guy that he played wide receiver. He's 6'3" and 220, and they moved him to running back later in the season and gave him some carries, and he averaged almost 12 yards per carry. So when you watch him as a player, he was, just a guy that when he gets the ball in his hands, he makes plays happen. On the season, he had 71 total touches, so rushing attempts and receptions. He had over 1,100 yards and 12 touchdowns. So 6'2", 6'3", 220. I'm going to be interested to see what he runs because he's a really big guy, but he seems like he seems like the day 3 type of pick that comes in and ends up being the, kind of one of the more productive players from the draft in the right situation. So Gibson's a guy I really like. I thought that the other kind of big winner from the week was the kid out of Florida, the wide receiver. Was it Van Jefferson?
Yes.
Another guy that kind of looks the part, but he played at Florida. I was actually talking with some friends about this, and you hate to kind of compare, especially after only one season, but Van finished with 657 yards and 6 touchdowns. Not great numbers by any means. And then you had Terry McLaurin out of Ohio State. He went in the second round, and he only had 700 yards and 11 touchdowns his senior year at Ohio State. And then he came in and put up, really good numbers on an awful Redskins team. So, I'm not going to say he's going to be the same type of impact player. I don't think he's going to have over 900 yards and 7 touchdowns as a rookie, but I do think that Van Jefferson could be in a similar boat as a guy that his production numbers perhaps are a little bit less because of the situation he was in. Another guy to know, kind of just coming out of the whole weekend was the big kid out of Baylor, and I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Mims, and Denzel Mims. Yeah, and so 6'3", 215. Baylor receivers are always that take their numbers with a grain of salt. So, let's not go gaga over the fact that he's got 2 seasons with 60-plus catches and over 1,000 yards. But let's also be impressed that he's got 2 seasons with 60 catches and over 1,000 yards. That's kind of one of the things that when Justin and I did the draft breakdown podcast is you never wanted a guy to get worse as he grew in terms of age and as a player. And so when a guy like Mims has 61 and over 1,000 as a sophomore, and then he comes back as a junior and has 55 and under 800, you're like, okay, like, can we see another big season? So to come back and have 66 and over 1,000 and then up his touchdown total to 12, I thought was important, because it shows that, I mean, maybe he's not a guy that puts up 1,000 yards a season, but he seems like a guy that can be in the Christian Kirk range where he's at, that 700 yards per season, which on, late day 2, early day 3 is a nice fit for a receiver.
Bradley Anae, defensive end out of Utah, is a guy that I found kind of intriguing. Just one, watching him in Pac-12 play. 2, really impactful in the Senior Bowl game. I don't know what the measurables are going to come out at in terms of his movement skills, but the dude is incredibly productive, incredibly strong. I see maybe some Marcus Golden to him, except he's got a little bit better length, and I bet he's probably a little quicker. But I don't think anyone would be disappointed with him. And the question is whether he could transition to a 3-4 outside backer or not. But I think he would be low-key a nice pick to add to the Cardinals, depending on where he ends up going in the draft.
Yeah, and I was a guy, you kind of go back to even Zach Allen last year. He's a bigger, or he's a bulkier version of Zach Allen. Zach Allen's got 2 inches and only 20 pounds on him, so 6'3", 265 is what they listed an eye at. And again, you talk about kind of improving year to year. Typically, unless a guy is a freak like Chase Young, you throw out freshman year production. So as a true sophomore, he had 10 tackles for loss. 7 of those were sacks. As a true junior, he upped that to 7.5 sacks, and then as a true senior, he had 13 this year. So, is he kind of like a Nate Orchard type? Again, another Utah product. Orchard, but his jump wasn't as big as Orchard. Orchard, went from 3 sacks to 18.5. That's a huge jump in terms of production. The steady growth of an eye is more of what you're looking for, and I think the Marcus Golden comparison is apt. 6'3", 260 coming out. Golden went from 6.5 to 8 as a junior, from junior year to senior year. An eye again 7.5 to 14. That's not, or 7.5 to 13. Excuse me. That's not an overly outrageous jump. It may be that he's a bit limited, but to me, I think that's always okay. I thought that one of the big things that we saw in this week was that there's going to be some depth at the linebacker position that people were maybe underestimating coming out. I mean, everybody's kind of gaga over Isaiah Simmons, but the 2 kids from LSU both declared. Patrick Queen is going to be just a phenom. I don't think he's going to be around when the Cardinals come to the podium in the second round. But a guy to know, and I wrote about him. I talked to some scouts that really liked him. Akeem Davis-Gaither is a kind of a Telvin Smith clone. I don't know how much you remember about Telvin Smith, other than he retired. But remember Telvin Smith,
right?
Yeah, Telvin Smith came out, and he was drafted in the 5th round by the Jaguars. And the knock on him was his size. He played linebacker at Florida State, and people were concerned that the 6'3", 215-pound frame wouldn't be able to hold up in the NFL. Now, if that was part of the reason he retired, then they were correct, But Smith was drafted by the Jags and turned into one of the better linebackers in the NFL. Davis Gaither is a similar size guy, 6'3". He's a little bit bigger, 219 at the Senior Bowl. He is kind of that run and chase Darrell Washington type linebacker with that sideline to sideline speed. And one of the things that we've been kind of waiting to see is how the Arizona Cardinals address the linebacker position moving forward next to Jordan Hicks. They need somebody that is a bit more athletic and a guy that can run and chase a little bit more. Washington, came out at 6'2", 225. So there's a little bit of size difference, but I don't think people remember, and you might, but Darrell Washington did not run a huge number at the combine. He only ran a 4.66 40. So it wasn't like he came out and was just a freak. And so he played a lot faster than he timed. And so that's what I'm interested to see with Davis Gaither. The numbers from Washington at the combine were not eye-popping, but we saw that he was a guy that, despite being, quote-unquote undersized, he had length and he had the ability to really run, and that's what made the difference for him, and why he was such a talented player overall.
Any final players to kind of keep an eye on as the scouting combine comes up later this month to in terms of guys that we might not know now that we'll probably want to know in a few weeks?
I think there's a couple. There's this kid out of St. John's, Ben Barch. I know it drives everybody crazy when the Cardinals do that small school thing, but he really turned some heads at the combine, and people I trust told me that the two guys that you want to get in on are Ben Barch and Josh Jones at the offensive tackle positions. I think the Jones thing's out of the bag at this point. You're seeing him mocked in the top 15 of NFL drafts. So, but Barch is a guy to kind of know moving forward for Cardinals fans that really want to invest in the offensive line. I think Barch is that perfect day two guy that you draft after you franchise tag DJ Humphries for a year, and then you've got an in-house guy ready. So when Humphries moves on.
All right, with that, we will wrap up this show. That's a lot to process as we are cruising out past an hour and a half on this show. We will take a little bit of break, I think, over the next couple of weeks as we move ahead. We'll talk about the combine as it happens, and then we'll get ready for free agency, which hits in the middle of March. But on behalf of this edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening, as always. You can find us everywhere. Go Cardinals, and we will be back again soon enough. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, rise up, Sea Red.